Good day to all of you joining us here in Baku and online. Welcome to Unveiling the Money Trail, Climate Finance Accountability through Local Tracking and Validation. This COP29 side event is co-organized by the Climate Vulnerable Forum and V20 Secretariat, the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, the Climate Reality Project Philippines, and the African Climate Reality Project. I am Ian Soqueño. I'm the Energy Lead of Climate Reality Philippines. And on behalf of our partner organizations, I would like to thank all of you for coming to this event, a crucial discussion on climate finance. We are all humbled by your presence, which we take as a sign of your enthusiasm and commitment to not just enabling and mobilizing climate finance, but also ensuring that we keep track of the quality and the quantity of climate finance that flows into our countries. And we are excited to organize this event today, no less here in COP29, pegged as the Finance COP, where we expect a new goal on climate finance that will be adopted alongside the necessary measures to implement it in favor of vulnerable countries that need it the most. Indeed, to fight climate change, we need money and lots of it. Based on report, however, published by the UN Standing Committee on Finance, developing countries would need upwards of 2 trillion USD to reach their current targets. This amount is very far from the 100 billion USD target that should be mobilized by developed countries. And on the side of the recipient countries, the projects being funded are sometimes not aligned with their climate priorities. Inadequate needs-based finance and mismatch of priorities, these are among the most pressing issues in the mobilization of climate finance. And these are the issues that we hope to unpack and address in today's session. This side event will present the importance of tracking climate finance flows from the donor to the recipient countries, validating the reports submitted by these entities. We hope that by the time we end, we have all equipped you with fundamental knowledge on climate finance tracking, enough to get you started on your own local initiatives. And here, to set the tone for our subsequent discussions, is an expert on the subject, having championed climate finance access and accountability for over a decade. Let me introduce you to Mr. Kairos de la Cruz, the Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, or ICSC. Based in the Philippines, ICSC is an international non-government group advancing fair climate policy and low-carbon climate resilient development. Kairos is the Green Climate Fund's alternative active observer for civil society in developing countries. He also leads ICSC's convenership of GCF Watch, a Southern CSO-led initiative. Everyone, let's give a warm round of applause to Mr. Kairos de la Cruz.
Thank you, Ian. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. We are at the end of the week, and I'm quite sure you have other things in mind to do. So thank you for showing up. There is no better way to prepare us for a long-awaited break and to ease us into the slow walks and hopefully good food in the old city of Baku than to talk about climate finance accountability. I am Kairos de la Cruz, and I lead the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. As mentioned by Ian, ICSC is a Philippine-based organization working on just energy transition, urban development, climate policy, climate finance, strategic communications, culture, and community resilience building. This is ICSC's first ever official side event, and I take so much pride in welcome you all to it. In the next 90 minutes or so, we will hear from an esteemed lineup of presenters and reactors on the importance of climate finance accountability. And even more importantly, we will discuss how accountability is a responsibility shared by all stakeholders, from governments to communities, civil society, academia. It is everyone's business to know. It is everyone's responsibility to take part in ways of improving the systems that can support a full realization of an accountability approach that holds developed countries in delivering their pledges through the right modalities and our very own governments in utilizing climate finance correctly and equitably. In the halls across this venue, negotiations are on the way as to how much should developed and contributing countries should agree on as the new collective quantified goal. We all know that despite having existing texts, it is far from over. Finance for climate action is far from enough, but they are not completely absent. For years, developed and contributing countries, even multilateral development banks or MDBs, through various platforms, have been reporting their climate and climate-related financing for developing countries. The Philippines alone has several billions of US dollars of climate tagged finance reported. I can only imagine that the same can be said in other countries and regions around the world. However, the reporting system is so source driven that there is no way to ascertain how much these streams actually and truly contribute to the country's climate ambitions and plans. It is almost as if everything that are reported are taken as they are, and we are here to challenge that. No questions asked. The theme has always been no questions asked. This setup moved ICSC and several organizations in Asia and Africa, supported by our partners back then, Oxfam America, World Resources Institute, and ODI, almost 10 years ago, to start what we call the Adaptation Finance Accountability Initiative, or AFAI. Through this program, we tracked internationally reported climate financial streams to the local level of implementation. We tried to test whether a climate change adaptation program by a reporting country translated in real and practical terms support for the most vulnerable. Obviously, we got mixed results. Some are good ones, but some stand out to even be misreporting and over-reporting their impacts. With the NCQG being drummed up together, with other financing windows, with every dollar being negotiated, we should in turn help to ensure every dollar counts. Climate finance is important and crucial, but it will always be limited. We should make it count. We should make every dollar count. I hope that we leave this room inspired to take action to make sure we get what we deserve as climate finance. Thank you and welcome once again.
Thank you, Mr. Kairos. It's always inspiring to hear you speak. Now on to our presentations, and to streamline these discussions, let me now introduce our esteemed speakers, each of whom have extensive experience in climate finance. Presenting the climate finance tracking experience of the Philippines is Ms. Danica Supnet, the Climate Policy Director for the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. A warm of applause, everyone. Also here with us today to showcase data from their own climate finance tracking are our friends from the African Climate Reality Project, Branch Manager Aurelie Kalengan Jingo, Senior Campaigner and Coordinator Ms. Courtney Morgan, and the West Africa Hub Coordinator Ms. Nana Mariam Yusuf. We will also be hearing some insights from our two key guests, Mr. Soenke Kreft, Executive Director of the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and Ms. Geneva Georgina Laurel Oliveri, Deputy Director of the International Finance Reform and Trade of the CVFB 20 Secretariat. Let's now move on to the presentations. Should you have any questions for our speakers, please first take them down, and we will address those in our open forum later on. Without further ado, let me now give the floor to Ms. Danica of ICSC.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good afternoon to everyone. And of course, for those who are listening in online, hello also to you, everyone. So, I would like to start by sharing with you our experience in the Philippines, tracking climate finance, as mentioned by Kai from AFI. And now we are calling it the Climate Finance Accountability Initiative, or CFI. So, as we go to the next slide, again, as highlighted by Kairos in his remarks, the CFI initiatives, tracking or audit research, follow the methodology of the then AFI, where we data mine baseline information from the OECD and other various platforms. We also approach the donors through email exchanges, and if we are lucky, and if they are open also, we are always setting up an in-person consultation with them. Also, through as part of this initiative, we engage stakeholders at the country level, particularly our government agencies and non-state actors in the Philippines. And lastly, as part of the methodology, we try to local track through field visits and documentation. So as we go to the next slide, for this research, what we currently have is the snapshot of the 2010 to 2022 OECD climate finance tagged commitments and disbursements to the Philippines, of which, based on the numbers, a total of 11 billion US dollar was committed for both adaptation and mitigation, but only 4.2 million rather was dispersed as of the current report. Also, based on this number, as shown in the next slide, the numbers can be further mined by looking at specific indicators, such as sectors, sources of finance from both bilateral and multilateral sources, and the forms of finance flows in the form of loans, grants, among others. But the question is, how much more information can we gather and analyze from these data? The answer is, of course, it's very limited. Not all other information, such as beneficiaries, detail of the fund purpose, even the work or implementation plan, are provided by the OECD. And that's the reason why country level validation should be part of the methodology. We cannot also track all tagged commitments because these are large numbers and there are so many indicators and commitments listed on the OECD data. But as part of the audit or tracking exercise, we can always focus on one specific sector. So ICSC in the next slide, as we can share with you, an example of our sector-specific local tracking initiative, looking at the commitments to the Philippines from multilateral climate funds, which are also reported to the OECD database, particularly from the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility. So for this study, we focused on tracking initiatives that may be linked to advance just transition in the energy sector in the Philippines. So as we go to the next slide, based on the policy review, the GCF and GEF's policies, guidelines, and requirements for its funding proposals ensure a fast, just, and transformative transition, as well as mainstreaming gender, regardless of the sector and results areas. And it also seeks to support country priorities based on action plans, and policies, such as the nationally determined contribution and national adaptation plan, among others. However, further, as we go to the next slide, based on the project review. Now, this time we're looking at the project review provided in the published documents. The Philippines has a significant portfolio in terms of amount for energy related initiatives as funded under the GEF compared to the GCF. However, as we go to the next slide, in terms of another project review, there are, of course, several limitations. So the reviewed projects indirectly feature certain elements of a just and transformative energy transition, as well as gender responsiveness, which means the projects were not explicitly designed with just energy transition as a primary goal, since this is not currently included in the OECD database. So we're still using the OECD database or the tracking mechanism or the tagging mechanism of OECD to compare the information that we have based on the policies and projects that we are reviewing. So, however, some of the project contains elements or aspects that align with the principles of a just and transformative energy transition, such as the four elements or the four principles of justice. So, also based on the policy review, or the project review rather, there's also limitation on published implementation plans. So to further guide the research in assessing the elements of just transition in the energy sector. And there's also limited analyses, especially for multiple country projects, where specific sub projects have not been specified in the proposal yet, especially when it comes to looking at the gender aspect as well. So the bottom line is, if you go to the next slide, please. While there are limits to the information and tracking process itself, it can be a good start, a good starting point to build our country's case on climate finance accountability. And I would like to end by going to the next slide and sharing with you that the importance of tracking climate finance, because it provides us evidence for advocacy work on how climate finance are being spent and whether these fundings actually reach the most vulnerable population and communities. We don't stop, of course, by accounting climate finance when we have already a set goal, as we are already negotiating right now. Climate finance tracking work could contribute to national discussion of what should be accounted as climate finance and development finance accountability, and how much investment is needed to further advance our national climate targets. So with that, I would end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miss Danica. It's always inspiring to hear ICS work as the pioneer of climate finance tracking in the Philippines. Um, I'm sure all of you have questions for Miss Danica, but please keep it first as we move on to our next presentations. African Climate Reality Project, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks everybody for coming. We are now going to get into the African country data mining, specifically South Africa and Ghana. You will observe slight differences in the results, and they will be relevant to each country, and we'll kind of unpack some of that. Next slide. Just to give you the run of show, I will be covering the data for South Africa. Aurelie, our branch manager, will then cover the data for Ghana, and then Miriam, the coordinator of our West Africa hub, will share some insights into a site validation trip we actually took to Ghana. We'll be sharing our data within three themes. Firstly, where the funding is coming from, so bilateral and multilateral sources of funding. Then we'll discuss how the funding enters each country, so type of finance, and then finally, where the finances actually go, so which sectors that they are committed to in each country. And we'll look at this for adaptation and mitigation, and then for committed financing as well as dispersed financing. If we go to the next slide, I can give you a bit of context about the South Africa as a country before I get into the data. It is a country with around 62 million people. It is one of the most unequal countries in the world. It is also the highest emitter in Africa and is actually around 14th, 15th in the world. So the need to decarbonize is quite immense. The country has massive coal reserves, and this has been the main source of energy for decades. One of the biggest focus areas in the NDCs and in energy policy, in climate policy is energy for South Africa. So there is a massive push even internationally for South Africa to decarbonize its energy production, which is possible as it does have ideal conditions for solar and wind. So we're now going to get into the data on the next slide. The top 5 bilateral sources of financing for adaptation that have been committed to South Africa over the 2010 to 2022 period are on the screen, but I'm just going to mention the top 2. The first is France with 509.3 million USD, and then second we have Germany with 35.2 million US dollars. The rest are on the screen. Then we've got the top 5 bilateral sources of financing for adaptation that have actually been dispersed. So now this is the money that actually flowed into South Africa, and that's on the screen in orange. The top 2 are unchanged. So France first with 507.4 million USD and Germany with 33.1 million USD. We then have the top 5 bilateral sources of funding for mitigation that have been committed to South Africa over that same period. Top 2, once again, in blue on the screen, Germany with 1.6 billion US dollars, and France in second place with 794 million USD. This is quite interesting if you take into account the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or the JETP, that was agreed at COP26 with South Africa. The original international partner group that entered into the agreement was France, Germany, the UK, the US, and the European Union. The agreement stated that the international partners would at the time mobilize an initial 8.5 billion USD between 2023 and 2027, subject to an investment framework which was then agreed at COP27 with the South African government. This catalytic financing was intended to leverage a much greater level of resources then from both private and public sources post the agreement. Although this particular data mining exercise is outside of that timeline, it's quite interesting to see which of the countries overlap. So there is that history of bilateral agreements. On the next slide, we're going to look at how much of that was actually dispersed. So bilateral mitigation sources. The top two are Germany was with 1 billion USD, and then in second place, France with 505 million USD. So just a slight change there with the UK dispersing slightly more than they committed, taking the third spot if you look at the graph. Germany, not a surprising top spot, as they do have a pretty good trade relationship with South Africa and are quite well known to fund renewable energy projects in Africa, particularly in South Africa. They have committed to financing a shift to renewable energy, which often happens through their development bank, KfW. And as you can see, which is something that the Global South continues to talk about, especially at this COP, is that the financing for adaptation is significantly lower, with the top spot for mitigation being $1 million and the top spot for adaptation being just about half of that. Next slide. Beyond just the country agreements, we also have data on the multilateral deals, so climate finance given by funds and foundations. The top 5 are on the screen. But in first place, we've got the Gates Foundation with 16 million USD, and in second place, the Adaptation Fund with 9.9 million USD. Once again, multilateral adaptation sources by disbursement. So orange on the screen, top 2 is the Gates Foundation with 10.5 million USD and the Adaptation Fund with 6.5 million USD. The next slide will show you the multilateral sources now committing to mitigation financing. In first place, we have the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, so the World Bank, with 3.7 billion USD, and in second place, the Climate Investment Funds with 330 million USD. If we then look at disbursement in orange, in first place, we've got the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, again, the World Bank, 578 million USD, and then the Bezos Earth Fund with 16.6 million USD. Again, same thing, we're observing that adaptation is much less than mitigation financing. It's also important, if you go to the next slide, to understand how the financing actually comes into the country and beyond just who is giving it. So as we know, loans have the potential to lock the Global South countries into debt cycles. And so the preferred format of financing is, of course, grant-based financing, which is something that we have been calling for at COP29. So let's have a look at the data for that same period, 2010 to 2022. The total money committed was 670. Sorry, for adaptation financing. The total was 672 million USD. 10.7 million of that was equity investments. 138.5 million of that was ODA grants. 505.8 million USD was ODA loans, which is a massive 75% of the total. And then we've got 16.8 million committed through private development finance. If we then look at disbursement, we see 8.2 million USD being equity investment, 127 million was grants, and then 504 million was loans, which is 77% of all money received was loans, and then 11 million for private finance, giving us a total of 651 million USD. So it's really important to look at how much of the adaptation financing is loan-based in South Africa, which is very concerning because the country has to then pay that money back in a foreign currency. Once again, really, really concerning for us because the South African rand is a lot weaker than the US dollar. And of course, that presents an issue for us. Adaptation financing is particularly important in Africa because we are being hardest hit, yet we have had the smallest contribution to the crisis. So adaptation financing should ideally be grant-based because it is a matter of justice for Africa and a matter of survival. We do not, unfortunately, have the resilient economies that can adjust to climate change impacts. And so we really need financing with no strings attached in order to build our adaptive capacity. If we move on then to mitigation, so still we are looking at the type of finance, or the format of the finance. The total money committed was 7.1 billion USD. 148.2 million was equity investments, 519.5 million was grant-based, 2.4 billion was ODA loans, and then more than half at 3.9 billion was other flows, other official flows, which is non-export credit. If we look at the actual money dispersed, we have a total of 2.6 billion USD, 144.6 million equity investments, 338.3 million ODA loans, 1.3 billion USD was loan-based, 823.1 million was other official flow, and then 28.9 million was private investment. Important to notice here that the disbursement compared to commitment is very, very different. On the next slide, we will then start to look at beyond who is giving the money or how it's coming into the country, where's the money actually going? What are the sectors that are being funded under mitigation and adaptation? So for the sectors that were committed to under adaptation financing, the total amount committed for adaptation was 672 million USD. In first place, we have other multi-sector, which was 43% of the total money. Banking and financial services was 35% of the total money. Agriculture at 8%. General environment protection was just 3%. And then basic health was 2%. That same, so adaptation by sector, by disbursement. So the pie chart on this side of the screen, 45% was other multi-sector, 36% was banking and financial services, 6% was agriculture, 3% was general environment protection, and then 2% was basic health. Yeah, and then we're going to move into, sorry. And then if we move on to the next slide. Okay, sorry, that screen is not working anymore. We're then going to look at the mitigation financing by sector. So the total commitment was 7.1 billion US dollars. Energy generation from non-renewable sources was 49, so nearly half of that money was committed to non-renewable sources. And then in second place, you had energy generation from renewable sources being 26% of total commitment. Energy distribution was 7%. Energy policy was 6%. Transport and storage was 5%, with the remaining 7% being from other sectors such as agriculture and banking, as we saw. And then if we move on to the pie chart showing the disbursement, this is now actually what money was received. We had a total of 2.6 billion USD. Energy generation from renewable sources was now 32% of total dispersed. Energy generation from non-renewable sources then dropped to 20%. Energy distribution was 17%. Transport and storage was 12%. And then other multi-sector was just 5%. So really interesting to notice here that in commitment, it's non-renewable energy generation that's the highest, but in disbursement, it's renewable energy financing that was the highest. So that is potentially due to pressure over that decade. So if you look at the period of 2010 to 2022, within that period, we of course had some landmark climate agreements, and that could be attributed to why we saw that drop. We are now going to get into the data for Ghana.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Good afternoon, everyone. Looking at the Ghana data, Ghana is a country in West Africa with around 32 million people. And one of the main ecological issues the country faces is deforestation and climate change, causing droughts and flooding. Ghana also has a pollution issue that affects public health. And the country has a large agricultural sector, accounting for about 54% of its GDP by exporting cocoa and fruit products. So these increasing intense heat and possible flooding put Ghana's agricultural sector at risk, which employs nearly half of the workforce. Let's get into the data now on the next slide. Also looking at the same period, 2010 to 2022. We'll start with the top 5 bilateral sources of financing for adaptation that have been committed to. That's the graph in blue. As you can see, the top 2 in first place is Germany with 162.7 million. And in second place is Korea with 152.5 million. It's also important to note that Germany is highly invested on the African continent for the implementation of renewable energies, and Courtney touched on this briefly just a short while ago. But looking at the orange graph, we have the top 5 bilateral sources of financing that have been dispersed. Germany again in first place with 129 million, and then Canada with 89.3 million. The next slide shows the top 5 bilateral sources of financing for mitigation that have been committed in blue. Germany in first place with 370 million, and following closely behind is France with 326.9 million. Now, this data is not significantly surprising, except for Korea, perhaps. However, it's well documented that Korea and Ghana have trade relations, particularly in precious metals and foodstuffs, such as cocoa and fish. And just this year, Ghana signed a $2 billion deal with Korea for development financing aimed at improving infrastructure, agriculture, among other things. When we look at the orange graph, that's the funds for mitigation that were dispersed. We have Canada in first place with 147 million, and close is Germany with 146 million. And as you can see, Korea falls out of the top 5 here in disbursement. So it would be a deal to watch and track when and where this financing goes. Some other observations are that Germany leads both adaptation and mitigation finance with substantial commitments and disbursements. When you look at Canada, it shows over disbursement in mitigation, but is relatively balanced in adaptation. The United States and Korea, consistent donors in both categories, but Korea's disbursement rates are lower than its commitments. In general, we see that disbursement rates for mitigation are significantly higher than those for adaptation, reflecting higher emphasis on funding mitigation projects over adaptation. And the implications of this imbalance between the two are profound and multifaceted. For Ghana to be able to build resilience against climate impacts and really achieve sustainable development, it's essential to increase the focus on adaptation finance. And this includes promoting transparency, engaging local communities, and really aligning donor priorities with Ghana's specific climate challenges. Moving on to the next slide, let's look at multilateral adaptation funding sources now. The top 5 that have been committed to are in blue. Sharing first place are the Climate Investment Funds and the International Fund for Agricultural Development with 40 million. And then there's MasterCard Foundation with 28.7 million. Now looking at disbursement, the top 5 are also there in orange. First place, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with 11.8 million, and second place, the MasterCard Foundation with 9.6 million. Now the Climate Investment Funds and IFAD, despite being the largest sources of committed adaptation finance, do not appear on the list of the top 5 dispersed sources. And this suggests delays or perhaps obstacles in moving the funds from commitment to actual deployment. On the other hand, we've got the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which shows both relatively high commitments and high disbursements. This is not a surprise because of their introduction of the so-called green revolution in Africa. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen the foundation giving close to $6 million to Africa to assist with agricultural development and hunger alleviation. But many climate justice and food sovereignty groups have critiqued their approach, saying that it doesn't foster an inclusive or holistic approach to hunger, but rather that it focuses on commercial agriculture and agribusiness and has been rapidly gaining control over the food systems in Africa. Let's move on to the next slide now and look at the data for mitigation funding sources. The top 5 that have been committed to Ghana are up there. I'll look at the top 2, International Development Association with 70 million and EU institutions with 34.4 million. And when you look at disbursements, top position there is the International Development Association with 56.1 million and the Climate Investment Funds with 8.2 million. Now, this significant gap between committed and dispersed funds is critical in the context of Ghana's urgent need for climate finance to address its vulnerabilities. And it also demonstrates the need for effective reporting and monitoring and evaluation processes. The low disbursement rates that we're seeing for certain multilateral sources indicates a need for increased transparency in how the funds are allocated and utilized. Stakeholders in Ghana could perhaps advocate for clearer guidelines and timelines to ensure that the committed resources translate into tangible outcomes. So as Ghana continues to navigate its climate challenges, ensuring that committed funds are rapidly dispersed and effectively used, it will be very critical for achieving its climate objectives and enhancing resilience to climate impacts. Let's move on to the next slide and look at the types of adaptation funding now. That's the graphs that you're seeing in blue. From a total committed amount of 930.1 million, 529.2 million was grants, 298.5 million was loans, 50 million was other financial flows, and 52.2 million was private development finance. The orange bars there show the actual disbursements, which amount to 495.4 million. Most of the money dispersed from that amount, or 429.2 million to be specific, was grants. 43 million was loans. And when it comes to other financial flows, nothing was dispersed, and 23.1 million was private development finance. The next slide shows mitigation. The total amount of money that was committed to Ghana was 1.3 billion. Of the total, 612.8 million was grants, 660 million was loans, 52.5 was other official flows, and private development finance was $3 million. The bars in orange show that out of a total of 668.8 million rather, a massive 476.5 million of those dispersed funds was grants. Loans was 142 million, 46.7 million was other financial flows, and slightly more, but still quite low, private development finance at 3.1 million. So we see quite a large increase in grant financing from just 46% commitment to 71% disbursement. And this shift suggests a greater emphasis on grants over loans in actual disbursements, especially post 2016, likely an outcome of the Paris Agreement in 2015, which we know pushed for climate finance solutions that don't increase debt for vulnerable nations. And this trend is positive for Ghana as grants alleviate debt pressure while still supporting climate mitigation. Looking at adaptation now on the next slide, the total money was $930 million. And for the sectors that were committed to under adaptation financing, 28% was agriculture. Coming in at 16% was banking and financial services. Transport and storage was at 8%, and then at 8% basic health and water supply and sanitation. Once again, it's important to look at what sectors actually received money for adaptation efforts, and that's the graph on the, well, my right-hand side. The total was 495.4 million, agriculture 36%, banking and financial services 20%, basic health 10%, and at 7% both general environment protection and water supply and sanitation. Let's look at the next slide now, which sectors mitigation financing is committed to in Ghana. Of a total of 1.3 million, energy distribution received 34%, agriculture 16%, energy generation, renewable sources 12%, energy policy 10%, and industry 7%. And in terms of the sectors that actually received money for mitigation over that period, the total money dispersed was $668.6 million. Agriculture, 27%, energy policy was 13%, energy generation, renewable sources, slightly less, 12%, banking and financial services, 9%, and energy distribution, 7%. So the high 32% that's been categorized as other in disbursements suggests that mitigation financing in Ghana is spread across a diverse range of sectors, likely addressing emerging or secondary priorities that weren't initially planned. As mentioned, agriculture is a huge part of Ghana's GDP, and so it's the highest disbursement for both mitigation and adaptation. And now that we've gone through the numbers, it's important to give some context into how all of this translates on the ground, and Miriam is going to take us through that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we've heard the numbers, we really have to look at what is happening on the ground in terms of local actions. So I'm going to start with the background information on the sites validation exercise we conducted in Ghana. This was at the Werobong Forest Reserve. It was one of the selected sites for the Community Forest Management Project that was funded by the African Development Bank in 2003 with an amount of 10,000 UA. So UA is actually a special currency used by the African Development Bank, which relies on multiple currencies and not just one currency to make it very stable. And this is part of adaptation financing in Ghana. So the Community Forest Management Project was initiated by the government of Ghana to rehabilitate degraded forest land, like the Werobong Forest, which was initially destroyed by bushfires, mostly in dry season. So the purpose of this validation was to assess impacts of the project since its implementations. And here are some key findings that we have. Yeah. So at the beginning of the implementation, the Forestry Commission in Ghana, with some government officials, engaged the chiefs and leaders in the community to discuss the project's benefits to the people and the environment. The land actually covers 4,800 hectares of forest, which was, restored by the plantation of thick trees and has greatly conserved the biodiversity, improved the soil quality of the community, which led to food security in the region, and also protected the fragile water sources in that community. It led the employment of almost 300 people in the community, and also from nearby villages. So this included men, women, and the young people. No one was left behind. It actually improved the livelihoods of people in the community by building the capacity of men, women, and the youth through training of agroforestry practices to enhance their farming activities, which was highly protective and sustainable, and also preserve the people's culture because they were not forced to adopt new practices to, boost to actually in line with commercial agriculture that actually puts pressure on the soil. No, this actually preserved their culture and enriched the quality of the soil that supported different plants and crops, and also a home of various species. The implementation of the community forest management project prevented the occurrences of bushfires and floods. It enhanced the sustainable farming practices in the community and ensured food security. Also, this forest serves as a home for various species of plants and animals, as I mentioned, and also organisms in the soil, which are highly important. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that this project actually led to the infrastructure development of that particular community because it was a local community. And so infrastructure like the construction of feeder roads that connect these areas together to the market centers, and most importantly is facilitated transportation to the project sites and the market, of course. And however, these constructions were not completed, sadly, after the financing was over. So it made it difficult and almost impossible for the people to, visit project sites and markets, especially during raining seasons. So during our validation, the community members actually expressed their ongoing problems and challenges that they faced, which included little or no medical support for field injuries, and also unmet project promises, and the sudden termination of the project without adequate communication or compensations. And so would like to share some photos. Here are some photos from our validation. So as you can see, on the right left corner, that is actually some beautiful photo we took of the forest, actually a very good forest. And as we can see on our left, there's a picture of a huge timber tree that was cut down. So this was not in that particular forest. This was another, another area of forest cover. So it caught our interest, and we decided to, engage the people in that area, those that were engaging in that exercise, that why do they cut down trees from forest, and how do they ensure that the other little trees around that big tree is not affected, because this is mostly used for commercial purposes in the country. So upon engaging them, we were told that they had concessions from the government to actually cut down the tree, and they had processes and procedures on how they do it, but they ensure that no other tree is affected. But as you can see in the photo, that the other little trees were actually broken down and cut down, which was very sad. And so next slide. Yes, so this is the engagement we had with the elders of the community that took part of the project. They actually shared the success stories, that it actually improved their livelihoods because they had multiple sources of income as part of their farming practices. And so this is one elder of the community we engaged on the left, and on the right is a farmer who still farms in that community. And so this validation was conducted by climate reality leaders in Ghana. And so this shows how involving we are in the process. Next slide. We also engaged women in the community without leaving them out. So the woman you see on my right actually had to be part of the project because her husband passed away, and they were greatly benefiting from the project. But as a widow, since the project terminated in 2009, she had no other source of income, and has really affected her life. So whenever it's in the rainy season, she cannot go out. And also they were being compensated monthly based on the protection of the forest reserve because they were farming as part of as part of the agroforestry practices while conserving the forest. So on my left, that's a group photo of us, the climate reality leaders, and also the farmers in that community. Yes, next slide. So yeah, this is also some photos we would want to share with you to also demonstrate the involvement of women. One of the key highlights of the project was it did not, prevent or limit it to just the elders and the men in the community. So some women joined the project as early as the 20s, in the age of the 20s till their 30s, because it lasted for almost a decade, But sadly, it was terminated, and the officials, the government officials, did not come back because measures or measures to track to ensure that the project continues even after finance was over was not properly put in place. So this project actually demonstrates the potential of climate financing that is inclusive and it builds resilience in local communities. But as we also observed from the stories, from the validation, without proper tracking and accountability measures, it also has the potential to leave the communities behind, making them more vulnerable, kind of like taking one step forward and 10 steps backwards because they've already adapted to a new way of life, and now they have to go back because due to no proper tracking and accountability mechanisms. And so this is exactly why we are here today to launch the Climate Finance Accountability Tracker, which is very important to us as civil society organizations, as climate reality leaders, as climate advocates and activists, to assess impacts of this financing in local communities because they are very, very essential. We need to ensure that no one is left behind. And we believe that to promote climate justice, it also includes social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney, Aurelie, and Nana, for that very wonderful presentation on the case of Ghana and South Africa's local climate finance tracking. But before we open the floor for questions, I'd like to call on Mr. Zinke for his thoughts about the presentation so far.
Thank you. Thank you also for allowing me to give some perspectives based on the activities and work that we do. I mean, first, let me start and reiterate also the importance of local level and national level tracking and validation of climate finance. I think we need it for climate finance transparency to not only rely on like source-based information, but really also have like national, local ground truthing and also even shadow reporting of data. So we have a multitude of sources when we have the debates, for example, happening right now in the climate talks. A second aspect, I think for me, it's also important to see that topics like green transformation, national resilience building, cannot be a technocratic endeavor. It actually needs the whole of society, and that needs informed stakeholders. So I think informing the stakeholders, having national perspectives is really important for the national debates, not only to come up with aggregate top-down numbers. And maybe the last general kind of remark is that also to think about validation. I think when we are talking about aggregate numbers, we are often look, or when we track, we often look at the committed amounts, but not actually at the dispersed amounts, and we're not looking at what is done with the money. So also these aspects of not only quantity of climate action and climate finance, but also quality, I think is important. Kind Coming now maybe to our perspectives, what I want to bring to the table. So I represent MCII, the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and we are a non-profit think tank, and we try to promote climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, especially for at-risk populations and countries. And maybe quickly to explain, climate disaster risk finance and insurance speaks about pre-arranged financial instruments, concepts, and mechanisms that help against climate and disaster risks. And they need to be always in the context of adaptation, risk management, and also with a view to reduce vulnerability. The end objective is that we reduce the protection gap, financial protection gap. We can also say that, and in a very easy way to say what the protection gap is, it's the difference between what you have and what you need in the case of a disaster. And so this is a very ongoing debate. Also, it has some momentum with international initiatives in the space, and it's part of climate finance for sure. But also it has some specific distinctions, and I want to maybe get a few perspectives on what we think also needs to be part of tracking locally climate and disaster risk finance. So this is based on an initiative and a project that we're doing called MAPS, Multi-Actor Partnership, which really works around involving and capacitating local and national stakeholders from the civil society, but also from the private sector and academia to accompany national processes when it comes to climate and disaster risk finance. And we are active in 6 countries. We initiated this together with ICSC, but also CARE Germany. And we are active in 6 countries and in 1 region, the Caribbean region, and really bring together civil society, private sector, academia, and government, and to also look at how to build up these the solutions, but also to track their performance and to track their payouts when certain events are happening. And just a few perspectives. I think when we talk about traditional climate finance tracking, we're often looking at projects and programs, and then we are looking at the dispersed amounts. I think when we are looking about the effectiveness of CDFI, we also have to look at additional elements, and that includes, for example, the element of speed, how fast the payout has been done. It includes the element of targeting, so how targeted the payout has been done. It also includes informed views on the costs of instruments. So, for example, if we are talking about an insurance instrument, which can be part of climate and disaster risk finance, then is it a fair price for insurance, for example? It also talks about questions around, for example, risk responsibility. So who's actually to whom the instrument is actually targeted at the end of the day. So these are all type of aspects we need to take into account, which for me also speaks to creating specific tracking on CDFI for the same reason that I started off with. This is also not just a technical debate. It's really also bringing different stakeholders on board. And like one thing we've done in the different countries is to have an initial baseline assessment to really understand what are the instruments that are in place, in a way standby, to then also, in the event of a disaster, be able to react to it and then to look at what needs to be tracked. And I think this type of approach is important also when we talk about operationalization of the new loss and damage fund and the funding arrangement, where it's not only about a project-based approach, but it's really also about setting up triggers and directly helping countries in the event of disasters and slow onset events. Yeah, thank you so far, and hand over.
Thank you, Mr. Soenke. Thank you for underscoring the importance of looking at the quality of climate finance and not just the quantity of climate finance, and how local climate finance tracking can actually reduce the financial protection gap, and also underscoring the value of engaging all stakeholders involved. Thank you very much. Now let's give the floor to our last speaker, Ms. Geneva from the CVF V20 Secretariat. She will be sharing insights on what it means for climate vulnerable countries to track climate finance. Ms. Geneva.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm from the Caribbean, and I'm here in Soenke. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? I think we're all butchering it. I have worked closely with the MAPS program, and I definitely see the level of consultation and data collection that goes into ensuring that there's some tracking that takes place. But of course, today I'm on the panel here representing the Climate Vulnerable Forum, a vulnerable group of 20. And we are an intergovernmental organization that's headquartered in Ghana, and we represent 70 member states. And it's not just 70 random countries, we represent 70 climate vulnerable countries. And when we talk about climate finance, it's about ensuring that the right finance or the right funding gets to these particular nations. So we continue to highlight the economic toll that climate change has really forced or affected on us, V20 countries. Worse than our debt situation. For me, being from the Caribbean, I could speak intimately that we are the top 8. So 8 of our Caribbean countries are in the top most indebted small island developing states in the world, and that's not something to boast about. So with this growing debt situation and the need for financial protection, we talk about climate finance, but we have to talk about climate finance and what it means to us and how can we be most efficient and most effective in delivering it. So there's a serious climate finance gap, especially for us, as I would have said. And further to this, the data has shown that we have major outflows of capital from developing countries that amounted to $40 billion last year. So now we're looking at poor inflows to some countries, poor tracking, and then we have serious outflows happening. So what is really happening here? What's the dynamic? So then the question of accountability becomes clear. So what is climate finance? Have we yet defined that really in any major way? Do we understand what is it that is coming into our country? What is considered to be climate finance? I think that's the direction that we need to go in terms of our country's understanding. So without any universally agreed definitions, tracking flows and ensuring alignment can then become a problem. So it brings us then to why we're here at COP29 and the ongoing discussions under the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal. And it must, I think, prioritize clarity and inclusivity. However, accountability cannot stop at the international level. As our panelists have been discussing, it must happen at the local level as well. So that's really where the impacts are felt. We could set all the regulations and policies in place at the international level, but at the end of the day, we must ensure that we have something happening at the local level where the real impacts are. So in September this year, my organization at the United Nations General Assembly, all our leaders met and we agreed to a particular declaration. We endorsed a declaration that outlines key pillars to redirecting finance flows towards fairer implementation of climate finance. So we understand the relevance of this topic. The leaders stressed 5 areas where they wanted to realign financial flows, and tracking these would be an avenue for accountability. So we have green industrial policy. That's a big topic, especially I know in Ghana, that's a big deal for you all. Trade partners must support greater opportunities for regional cooperation to unlock the full potential that we could get from green industrial policy. However, how can we unlock this potential if we have no real idea of what's going on? So tracking then becomes a major and very important issue. We have locally led finance, redirecting finance to national and regional institutions. Those are critical now through country platforms supported by deal teams. So the CVFV20, we can strengthen that capacity. However, we need to know numbers, we need to know impact, we need to know gender specifics, which vulnerable and marginalized communities are being affected, what are some of the blockers, or who are the enablers. We need to know what are the structural barriers. That is what tracking would do, and that's the kind of information that it will give to us. And we have climate finance access, which really is what we're talking about as the overarching issue here. So it's essential to scale up direct access. We have found that oftentimes climate finance or the funds would go to an agency before it reaches the country or the governments. And something happens in that middleman where they take out some money for this and some money for that, and then we don't know what happens when it gets to us and it's a smaller amount. So encouraging direct access, I think that will be critical. And that to me is part of tracking and accountability. That's essential. I wouldn't go into detail, but I mentioned the loss and damage fund. That will require its own set of tracking, monitoring, and evaluation to ensure that the right amounts go to the right groups, the right nations at the right times. I could go on and on. Finally, tracking and improving funding performance. We at the V20 Secretariat, we call on the G20 specifically to mandate annual reviews of climate finance flows to vulnerable nations. This accountability mechanism will help track progress, identify gaps, and ensure funds deliver on their promises, because that's what we really want. We want the funds to deliver on their promises. We want the agents, the entities to deliver on what they promised to do. Earlier, we saw some data in relation to what was committed and what was actually disbursed. And I think that's critical when we're tracking to see really where the gaps are and how we could address them. So we are here at COP29, and most of us are probably tired from running up and down and working late at night. I know I am. But we need to remind ourselves of the importance of for instance, the NCQG, as I mentioned, transparency reporting systems. We need to drive it home with our governments as civil society agents. The good thing about civil society, I used to work in civil society, and I always like that space. You get to say what you want, and you're not bound by government mandates. So say what you have to say, drive that particular point home, because that will become very critical. While I may be bound by a government or a particular position that was driven by government or developed by government or passed or endorsed, you all are not. So please say what you have to say. Yes, say your piece. Right, so I wouldn't go on from here. You all may have your questions, and they're very much open and available to answer them. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Geneva, for that spirited message of yours. Thank you for highlighting how local climate finance tracking as an avenue of accountability and how CF tracking can really help address the climate finance gap in the most effective and most efficient way. It brings us back to what Soenke said about the aspect of speed and how targeted climate finance should be to the priorities of developing countries. You also said about the modality of dispersing climate finance on how critical direct access is for vulnerable countries. Thank you for that. We now open the floor to the audience for your questions. Please state your name first, and if you want to address it to a specific person or a specific speaker or address to all, please do so. Please indicate. Sir, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Kofi Donago from Ghana, and I'm happy to hear you talk about CVF and V20. I have the opportunity to get a little closer to CVF and then V20. I was also privileged to be sponsored to the African Climate Summit in Kenya, so I'm very happy for that. But my issue has to do with awareness about your activities. I know, correct me, I know you having an office in Ghana. Now, as a communicator, I have a problem that has to do with how we communicate in your activities and what we do to our people at the local level. especially making our members of parliament, I work in parliament, so I'm making our members of parliament to be more interested in your activities so that they can also communicate the issues. You're talking about funding. As to whether there's funding available, a lot of them are not even aware. So how are we creating the awareness? How are we making sure that they are able to get information? Then they can also leverage on what you do. So I want to urge you, or probably tell us how we should go about all this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that intervention. It's something we need to work on a bit more, but I would say that we engage various bodies. So, for instance, we have the Central Bank Governors Group, which is a part of our meetings. So we meet with them periodically, and we actually have a working group. It's now headed by Barbados. Barbados is chairing because Barbados is now our president. So Prime Minister Motley is our president. So the central bank governor for Barbados was the now chair. So they actually met in Washington recently at the IMF World Bank meetings, and they're drafting a particular document and policy and working through a work program for the next 2 years. So we have that. And then we have the group of finance ministers, and they meet as well. Apart from that, we also have our parliamentary group whereby we meet and we have that constant engagement. And nothing that we do at the secretariat is endorsed without, of course, the okay and the approval of the 70 members. So we ensure that we have that endorsement coming in. And I think that the secretariat has done a fantastic job in doing that, if I should say so myself. However, we are always open to more of that. Apart from that, one of the main aspects of our work program is something we call country prosperity plans. And that forces or compels us to go into particular countries and meet with various agencies, specifically the Ministry of Finance and then satellite, well, I shouldn't say satellite, other ministries such as environment, housing, etc., to see what are the needs in terms of investment, climate finance, and other types of investment, bankable projects that would then drive sustainable development. I know my colleagues, I have a couple of colleagues in the room here who would have gone into Bhutan recently. Hamza went into Bhutan, and we have Madagascar, we have Bangladesh, Pakistan, we have Haiti now is being drafted. So we go into the countries and we work directly with the ministries to then draft and find out what it is, where the support is needed, and how we could then create bankable projects to invite investment into the country. So that is the level of engagement we have, apart from, of course, engagement at the G20 level and task force at IMF, etc. So that's really how we engage. But of course, afterwards we could always meet and discuss how we could improve that engagement further. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tasizio Kalaund, a CVF fellow. My question in particular, I know finance accountability tracking is being done based on resources that are trickling in. And my quickest reaction was, how can we actually track value for money for the projects that we implement on the ground? Because that would also as well help us to build the evidence that we're talking about of direct access. Because maybe the reservations that have been shared by people is maybe could be issues of institutional capacity, or maybe the resources that have trickled down to communities have not lived up to actually bring about the needed community transformation. And I'm looking at this too as a brilliant approach to say, we have so many projects being implemented at national level, either by humanitarian actors or by the government itself, all these reflecting back to our national determined contributions. But my quickest question is, do we know how much value for money we are actually accounting for in different countries that we're implementing this project? So using this approach, I just wanted to pick your mind to understand what could be the best modalities and approaches to actually track the actual project implementation based on the resources that have been received, and then linking it back to the NDC and see if at all the resources that we have pumped in are reflecting the community transformation that we're supposed to see, and using that now as evidence for direct access. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarsisha. I'll direct that question to Danica first, then Courtney, Aurelie, and Nana.
Yes, thank you for that question. Actually, I would also agree that it's really difficult to track the value of the money because what the OECD has provided us are just numbers. And the challenge is making sense of those numbers so that we can assure or ensure rather that these are really allocated to the most vulnerable communities at the local level. So what we are always do is that we try to engage actively with our governments, especially that most of the finance flows coming from international sources are flowing to our national government agencies. But some also are directed to our to civil society organizations, but a large part is still flowing to our governments. And it pays to visit them and discuss with them. We have these numbers. We want to know more about it because really there's a different story when it comes to implementation. We've encountered some stories also that yes, this is a finance flow from a certain bank or a certain agency, but then when it came at the local level, it's not the actual purpose of the project, simply because of some several issues such as bureaucracy, of course, some of the realignment of purposes at the national and local level. So there are so many stories on the ground. I think it was also shared a while ago. But then it's a matter of challenging our governments, not only at the national level, but also at the local level, to see how we can align our climate finance flows at the local level to ensure that it's aligned to the priorities of the local governments as well. Because the NDCs are our guidance, of course. Our NAPs are our guidance at the country level. But the stories are always at the local level. And it sometimes it differs, but always it's very helpful to share to our national government agencies what are the differences so we can still reform our policies at the national level, our mechanisms also to account for our climate finance mechanism. So
I think, yeah, I mean, it's a really great question, especially because you also have to understand what value means for different people, right? Like the donor and the beneficiary will see that word very, very differently, and their definitions of what is valuable will be different, right? But I think that's the beauty of the site validation. And we didn't go into the full methodology of how to do the site validations, but ideally you should not just be talking to the community, but you should also be talking to the implementers. So finding the actual intermediaries and the so-called like middlemen who deal with the money. You should also be getting the actual financial deals. So any public documentation around the deal. Um, and then when you link that, so you're linking the actual documents from the donor, you're then linking the intermediaries, the implementers, you're interviewing them, and then going to the community. I think that kind of gives you quite a good triangulation of the data, but also what's actually happening on the ground. And then I think when you link it to NDCs or when you link it to climate action in general, it's always the knowledge is power. So having this data as civil society is really, really powerful because this is how we ensure accountability and transparency. And yes, we can go and yeah, civil society, we can say a lot. So we can go to our governments and we can say certain things and we can demand certain things. But if we have data to support our social justice and our climate justice demands, I think that's really, really powerful. So not just using the methodology to actually track and to validate, but actually then using that as a tool for greater climate action, I think is really the power of the tracker.
I definitely agree with that. And I also think that exactly that's the importance of the work that Miriam, for example, did on the ground in Ghana, speaking to those local communities and doing the validation, because you can engage with government even at the local and provincial level. But in our countries on the continent, information is not always accessible and there's not always transparency from our leaders. So really going on the ground and getting that information and seeing if it correlates with the data that we've received and then using that for our activism is very powerful.
Yeah, to add up, in terms of transparency, when it comes to bilaterals, it's quite difficult. But in terms of the multilateral funding, for example, World Bank or the African Development Bank, you could find the project appraisal report and the completion report. So when you're able to, gather your data in these terms, you go to the site and compare if it's actually what is being, written in the reports or is being reported down. And secondly, because it's actually mostly driven by government initiatives, so it's highly or it's highly linked to the NDCs, which is also essential for you to track to see how has it been reported or how does it feed into the country's NDCs, which is also really essential for climate action.
Thank you for that. Before I take one last question, I'd like to go back to Zenke first and ask this question. On the CDRFI world, do you have any examples on how tracking for value is being done? Apart from speed, what are other elements that we should consider?
Yeah, definitely there are additional kind of diagnostics that have to be done. As I said, I mean, speed is one of them. Cost of capital is another one, especially if there's a mix between instruments that are financed externally and also financed by the government. Another one is targeting. And then we have the whole question around verifying also the impact of the payment after an event, which of course we don't wish to see a disaster, but to see how a payment has been channeled to the populations at need, I think is really important tracking element. And it's a different approach. What I mentioned is it's a different approach than going project by project and looking at project impacts. For example, an insurance payment might not realize, payout might not realize. We are looking at a catastrophic event. Yeah, so these are some elements that have to go into the diagnostic. While I quickly have the floor, just to say that I think so far, especially the discussions in the loss and damage fund or the fund to responding to loss and damage, I mean, has been on operationalization, getting a director, having the World Bank agree on documents, things like that. But now is actually the difficult time to set up the programmatic priorities of that fund and what's called the business case. But I mean, it's not a business case, but basically what the priorities of the fund are. And just to say, also through our MAPS engagement, we have seen, and another instrument is the Global Shield. There's quite an overlap between the countries that we are active in and the countries that are also engaging in the Global Shield process. And by having this informed and pre-informed stakeholders, they can make a meaningful input into these process, and they can also say what are the priorities of the governments. And I think that's again like an idea on how this can work. And I think it's also something that the fund to responding to loss and damage should take as a model or should look at as a model.
Thank you for that. One last question. We have 5 minutes left.
Okay, my name is Yusuf Haliru from the Country Program Advisory Team for IFA projects in Nigeria. And I have two questions for the first two ladies from my right. For you, you mentioned bankability when you were talking, and I was just going to ask you, are there any 2 or 3 features of proposals that have made them highly bankable that you can share with us? That's your question. And for you, when you are showing the picture of the widow whose income stream closed out because a project has stopped, I was touched. And I was going to ask you, from your validation exercise, did you see any inputs into the project document that will ensure that there's post-project sustainability after projects close out? And if you did, whose fault would you say it is that the income stream of that woman, for example, suddenly closed out as the project closed?
Should I go first? Okay. Okay, you can go first.
Thank you very much for that question. And I quite like your where. I've been observing all the ethnic wear here, and I get a little jealous whenever I see them. I see a hat as well. So in terms of bankable projects, so I would first start by saying that the purpose of the climate prosperity plans is really to ensure that the countries get something back, that they're not just generating projects that does not have a return. So in terms of how we measure that bankability, it must be return on investment. So for instance, it might be a reforestation project that may be able to, or a mangrove restoration project that would also have a climate, I guess a climate positive approach to it. But at the same time, the country might be able to get carbon credits, be able to sell on the carbon market, So that is one element of it. And then we have the whole idea of employment. To what extent are these projects then bringing in employment? And of course, the other aspects of the economy. How does it give back to the economy in a sustainable way? And of course, the climate sustainability element is a major, major part of it, because we have found that it is a sexy topic right now, and it's the area where we are seeking the most financing, especially for our vulnerable countries. I know that from my country, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I live in Barbados, and we have increasing flooding. We have coral bleaching. We have you name it. It's hotter, it's drier, we have more forest fires. We have issues that affect, for instance, farmers. So bankable projects should be, for instance, for example, a farmer. Technologies that will be able to help them withstand drought, or technologies that will be able to have them in and out of seasons, preserve their food and their goods so that they would go to the other season. These are bankable projects that of course would give them long-term effects. So when we think of bankable, we think of that ones that will of course generate investment that would be attractive for investors, but then the sustainability component must be a part of it, and resilience, of course.
In terms of measures that were put in place during the assessments and review of the completion reports of the project, unfortunately, there was no measures, and it was stated in the completion reports of the African Development Bank as the lows of the projects. And as part of it, it was mentioned that there was little or no engagement with community-based organizations that would have ensured the continuity of it. And there was nothing. And also there was also no involvement with civil society organizations that were working around that area. So that was a flaw from the project.
Thank you, everyone. That's all the time that we have left. Another warm round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great day ahead.